This story is about two boys who vanish without a trace. Did the feared OJUJU CALABAR take them, or is something darker at play? Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. If you're a fan of drama, suspense and stories inspired by the vibrant world of Nollywood, you've come to the right place. Here we bring you captivating tales filled with rich culture, deep emotions and unforgettable characters. So grab a seat, get comfortable and dive into this world of secrets and surprises. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to catch more thrilling stories. The story begins at Mr. and Mrs. Thomas's house in the city. While having dinner, Mr. Thomas received a message on his phone. Checking it, he was shocked to find it was from Peter and James's school, stating that the boys were making life unbearable for other students and that the school was tired of their behavior. Exclaiming in frustration, he said, "What?" Mrs. Thomas, curious, asked what the problem was. He showed her the report, and for a moment she was speechless. Mr. Thomas, however, began yelling at Peter and James, saying, "Look at the both of you. Are you not ashamed of yourselves? What do you want from me?" Peter interrupted, defending himself. "But Dad, it's not our fault. Those students are always crossing boundaries, and the teachers are just unfair." Mr. Thomas immediately cut him off, expressing his disappointment. Meanwhile, Peter and James, oblivious to the tension, started fighting over their food. This angered Mrs. Thomas so much that she lost her appetite, stood up and went to her room. Later that night, Mr. Thomas was sitting in the living room when Mrs. Thomas walked in. She said, "Honey, you're not saying anything about these children." Mr. Thomas replied, "What do you want me to say? I'm tired of them. They are getting more stubborn every day. I've tried everything as a father, but nothing works. I don't know what else to do." They both sat in silence, frustration weighing heavily on them. The next morning, Mrs. Thomas was in her room when her phone rang. It was her mother calling from the village, Peter and James' grandmother. After exchanging greetings, Grandma asked about the boys. Mrs. Thomas confessed, "I'm tired of them. They're becoming more stubborn by the day. Even their school is tired of them. They don't listen to anyone and nothing we do works." Grandma chuckled and said, "Is that why you're complaining? Send them to the village. OJUJU CALABAR will take care of them." Surprised, Mrs. Thomas asked, "Who is OJUJU CALABAR?" Grandma explained, "OJUJU CALABAR is a huge giant the king put in charge of dealing with stubborn children in the village. Ever since, the village has been peaceful. If any child refuses to obey, just mentioning OJUJU CALABAR will set them straight." Worried, Mrs. Thomas asked, "I hope there's nothing fetish or diabolical about it." Grandma reassured her, "Not at all. Trust me, OJUJU CALABAR will handle Peter and James. Bring them during the summer." Mrs. Thomas agreed and ended the call. That night, Mrs. Thomas shared the plan with Mr. Thomas. When she told him the boys would spend their holiday in the village, Mr. Thomas was surprised and asked why. She explained everything, and after some thought, he said, "No problem." The conversation ended there. The next morning, Mrs. Thomas went to Peter and James's room. As they prepared to come downstairs, she told them they would be spending their holiday in the village. Peter, excited, exclaimed, "Wow, really, Mom? We're finally going to see Grandma and Grandpa." She told them to get ready for breakfast and left, leaving the boys in their room, thrilled. Later that day, they approached their father in the living room where he was working on his laptop. Peter asked, "Dad, are you aware we're going to the village?" Mr. Thomas replied, "Aware of what?" Peter said, "That we're finally leaving this house where we have no peace." Mr. Thomas said, "If you like, go and make trouble there too." The boys laughed and returned to their room. As the day went on, Peter and James planned their village mischief. Peter said, "I can't wait to get to the village. No one will disturb us there. We can do whatever we want." They chatted and laughed, filled with excitement. A month later, Peter and James arrived in the village. Their grandparents welcomed them warmly. The boys, overjoyed, hugged them and couldn't wait to explore the village. After settling in, they began their long-awaited adventure. Later that night, Peter and James were in their room when their grandma called them to come and have dinner. When they saw the food, Peter asked, "Grandma, what type of food is this? We can't even eat it." She replied, "My son, this is the best food to keep you strong and healthy." She told them to sit and eat, but after trying the meal, they couldn't eat it. They left the table and went back to their room, leaving their grandma surprised by their behavior. The following morning, Grandma woke up and couldn't find Peter and James. She searched the compound and, while returning from the back of the house, saw them running at full speed with a man chasing after them. She quickly intervened, asking the man what was wrong. He explained that Peter and James had tried to steal a hen at the village centre. Shocked, she exclaimed, "What?" and pleaded with him not to harm them. The man said he was letting them go only because of her. After thanking him, she turned to Peter and James and yelled at them. Peter tried to explain, "Grandma, we were just playing when we saw the hen trying to escape, and we wanted to help." Before he could finish, she silenced him and told them to go inside. The next day, Peter and James were playing in the village when they met a boy named Samuel who lived there. They quickly became friends and started playing together. However, their mischief began to spread as they caused trouble around the village, influencing other children to behave like them. Later that day, while playing, Peter noticed a goat tied to a tree. He suggested they untie it so the owner would have to look for it. One of the boys, Samson, stopped them and warned that if the king found out, OJUJU CALABAR would come for them. Peter and James burst into laughter, mocking Samson. "OJUJU CALABAR doesn't exist," Peter said. "It's just a silly superstition. No one will find out." Samson tried to convince them otherwise, but Peter persuaded the group that OJUJU CALABAR was just a story to scare children. After some discussion, they all returned to their homes. The following day, Peter and James were at the village centre. They stopped a boy named Stephen and asked him to help them get something. When he refused, Peter slapped him and took what he had. The incident caused a scene, and Stephen ran away. That same day, a report reached the king about children causing trouble in the village, bullying others and influencing them to misbehave. Concerned, the king sent a message to Peter and James' grandma, warning her that if they didn't stop, OJUJU CALABAR would deal with them. When Peter and James returned home later, their grandma, worried and frustrated, asked where they had been. Peter casually said, "We were at our friend's house." She then asked, "Why are you two so troublesome?" Peter replied, "Grandma, we don't understand." She retorted, "You will understand when OJUJU CALABAR comes for you." They laughed mockingly, saying, "Grandma, you also believe in that nonsense? It's just superstition." Still laughing, they went inside, leaving her shocked. 2 days later, at Mr. Coco's house, Samuel's father, he called Samuel into the living room. He warned him to stay away from Peter and James because they were causing too much trouble in the village. Samuel pretended to listen but ignored his father's advice and went back inside. The next morning, Peter and James sat down for breakfast. Seeing the local village dish, Peter complained, "What is this nonsense? Grandma, we can't eat this." Grandma, surprised and offended by Peter's tone, told them, "This is what I have, and you have no choice but to eat it." They reluctantly nibbled at the food, then left the table and went back to their room. At the king's palace, he summoned OJUJU CALABAR to discuss the issue. He told OJUJU that some children had been misbehaving in the village and needed to be disciplined. OJUJU replied, "I've been watching them. I'm giving them time to change since they're new here. But if they don't change, I'll step in." The king agreed and praised OJUJU for his patience. After chatting for a while, OJUJU left. Later that day, Peter, James and Samuel went out to play. They started bullying other children who couldn't defend themselves, continuing their reign of mischief across the village. Later that evening, as all the children were heading home, Peter and James were nowhere to be found. Their grandma became worried since it was already getting dark. She searched everywhere but couldn't find them. Some villagers speculated that OJUJU CALABAR might have taken them because of their bad behavior. Desperate, she decided to visit the king to find out if OJUJU CALABAR was responsible for their disappearance. A few minutes later, she arrived at the palace and explained everything to the king. The king reassured her, saying, "Peter and James will be fine. Don't worry about OJUJU CALABAR." However, he immediately summoned OJUJU CALABAR and asked if he had taken the children. OJUJU CALABAR, surprised, replied, "No, I didn't take them." The king's face filled with confusion. If OJUJU CALABAR wasn't responsible, then who was? The king wasted no time and organized search parties to look for Peter and James. They scoured the entire village but found no trace of the boys. Returning to the palace, they informed the king of their unsuccessful search, leaving him deeply troubled. The following morning, Peter and James's grandma, who hadn't slept all night, returned to the king's palace. The king noticed her distress and tried to comfort her. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll find them, I promise." Despite his words, she remained worried as she left the palace. Later that day, the king summoned the search parties again, urging them to continue searching. They combed through the community, including the area where OJUJU CALABAR disciplined children, but still found nothing. Once again, they returned to the palace with no news. At Mr. Coco's house the next morning, the family was having breakfast. Samuel, uncomfortable and distracted, barely touched his food. His father noticed and asked, "Samuel, what's wrong?" Samuel pretended everything was fine, insisting, "I'm okay, Dad." Mr. Coco wasn't convinced. "Are you sure you don't know anything about your friends?" he asked. Samuel replied, "Of course, Dad, I don't know anything." After that, he excused himself. Later that night, Mr. Coco called Samuel into the living room. Seeing his son's anxious expression, he drew him closer and gently asked, "What's going on?" Samuel, on the verge of tears, finally broke down. "Dad, I'm really sorry," he confessed. "I didn't listen when you told me to stay away from them." Mr. Coco, now alarmed, asked, "What are you talking about?" Through tears, Samuel admitted, "Dad, I know where Peter and James are." Shocked, Mr. Coco asked, "What do you mean?" Samuel hesitated, then said, "That day we went to the Forbidden River. They convinced me that the king was lying about it being dangerous. While we were playing, throwing stones into the water, a huge wave rose and dragged all of us into the river. I managed to swim out, but Peter and James couldn't. They were left behind. I was too scared of being punished, so I didn't tell anyone." Mr. Coco sat in silence, his eyes wide with disbelief. Taking a deep breath, he finally said, "It's okay, Samuel. I'll inform the king about this." The next morning, Mr. Coco went to the king's palace to report what Samuel had confessed. The king, alarmed, quickly summoned fishermen and search parties to search the Forbidden River. They searched tirelessly, but there was no sign of Peter and James. Returning to the palace, they delivered the grim news to the king, who was left speechless. Peter and James's grandma, heartbroken and full of tears, returned home with a heavy heart. A month later, the village of Kpanchi was eerily silent. The disappearance of Peter and James left the children scared and the entire community in mourning. All hope of finding them seemed lost. One day, a fisherman from a neighboring village visited Kpanchi. While at the market, he overheard villagers discussing the boy's disappearance. Curious, he approached one of the men and asked, "Are these children the same ones I found in my village?" The man, surprised, asked, "Are you sure about what you're saying?" The fisherman nodded. "Yes, I'm certain." Immediately, the villager took him to the king's palace to share this astonishing news. Later that day, the fisherman arrived at the king's palace to share his story. The king, visibly surprised, asked, "Young man, are you sure about what you're saying?" The fisherman nodded. "Yes, my king, I'm certain. I found them unconscious by the riverbank while fishing. I helped them, but to my surprise, they couldn't speak. I've tried everything to get them to tell me where they're from, but nothing seems to work." Hearing this, the king immediately summoned OJUJU CALABAR and some of the village youth to accompany the fisherman back to his village. When they arrived at the fisherman's home, they found Peter and James sitting silently on chairs. The boys stared blankly, unable to utter a word. The group gently took them back to Kpanchi village, thanking the fisherman for his kindness. As the news of their return spread, the entire village rejoiced. People flooded the king's palace to celebrate, and Peter and James' grandma, who had lost all hope, was overwhelmed with joy. Yet her happiness was incomplete. The boys were still unable to speak. The next day, the king consulted the village's chief priest to seek a solution. The chief priest performed rituals and chants, but after much effort, he admitted he couldn't determine what had silenced the boys. Disheartened, the king allowed Peter and James's parents, who had arrived in the village, to take them to the city for a medical checkup. The doctor, after thorough examination, explained, The boys are suffering from trauma due to the shock they experienced. Their inability to speak is temporary. With time and rest, they will recover. Relieved, the family decided to be patient and care for the boys while waiting for them to regain their speech. A week later, Peter and James suddenly woke up one morning, able to speak. Overjoyed, they screamed in excitement and hugged each other tightly. They ran straight to their grandma, tears in their eyes, and apologized for all the trouble they had caused her. Their grandma, equally emotional, embraced them lovingly and forgave them. She then took them to the king's palace to seek his forgiveness. Upon arriving, Peter and James knelt before the king, pleading for forgiveness. Surprised but relieved, the king told them to rise and embraced them. While they chatted, the king asked, "Do you remember who pulled you out of the water?" Peter hesitated but replied, "I don't remember clearly, but I can describe the person. He was huge and had a scary face." Hearing this, the king immediately realized who they were describing. After much conversation, Peter and James left the palace with their grandmother. That same day, the king summoned OJUJU CALABAR to the palace. The king confronted him. "Why did you lie to me about the boys?" OJUJU CALABAR, bowing his head, confessed, "My king, I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to tell you. I pulled them from the water, but while I went to search for help, they disappeared. I thought the gods had taken them, so I couldn't explain." Though upset, the king understood his intentions and forgave him. Peter and James' parents also thanked OJUJU CALABAR for saving their children.
2 weeks later, Mr. and Mrs.
Thomas took Peter and James back to the city. The boys had changed remarkably. They were more humble, respectful, and well-behaved, surprising everyone who knew them. One evening during dinner at Mr. Thomas's house, he received a message from the boys' school principal. The message read, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, Peter and James have become the best students in the school. They are excelling academically and setting a great example for their peers. Whatever you're doing, please continue." Mr. Thomas read the message aloud, and the family beamed with pride. He encouraged the boys to keep up their good behavior, and they promised to do so. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this captivating story. Please don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more intriguing and thought-provoking storylines.